Good morning. We look at 1 Corinthians chapter 8 today, and Paul is talking about food. It's particularly food offered to idols, and how sometimes for others to see people eating the food that was offered to an idol, that it may be a stumbling block to their faith. And I think about this food that's been offered to these idols over all of these years. What do you suppose really happened to that food? I mean, the idols didn't eat it. They didn't need to eat food. They didn't need to drink water. They didn't need any of that stuff because they were an idol. They were non-existent. So what happened to a lot of the food that was offered to idols is that it went to feed the family of the priests of the specific temple for this specific idol. And I mean, that's the reality of it. What else would they have done with it? They certainly didn't just take it and throw it all away. We know that for sure. Well, I shouldn't say we know that for sure, but I mean, it's evident that way that this food that was offered to the idols was consumed in some respect, and it was most likely and most often consumed by the families of the priests, of the religious leaders of specific idols. And he starts out, he says, concerning food sacrificed to idols, he says, we all possess knowledge. And then he says, knowledge puffs up and builds up. And anyone who claims to know something but doesn't have the necessary knowledge, he talks about that. And, sometimes we get full of ourselves with our knowledge and stuff as well. But, he says concerning this food that's offered to idols, since we know that no God exists other than the one true God, that these idols really can't eat and drink, he's saying. He says there are idols, there are these false gods that people worship, but they're not the one true God. And this food that is sacrificed to the idols is still food that needs to be consumed, or something happened to it. And in verse 7, he starts to talk about it. He says, some have become so accustomed to idols that they think of the food that they eat that it was offered to an idol has somehow made them more sinful, or defiled them, or made them unclean. That if they were to go to the temple and ask for a blessing of food, if they were so poor and destitute that they needed to go to the temple of the idol, and this would happen, that they would bless, and give the food that way to some extent as well, and then these people would feel that they had done something wrong by eating this food that had been sacrificed to idols. And Paul says in verse 8, food will not bring us closer to God. He says we're no worse off if we don't eat or if we do eat. Well, I tell you, if I wouldn't eat for too many days, I wouldn't be around very long. And if I don't eat for too long, I start to get a little bit testy, and many of us do that. You start, your body needs nourishment. So, his words here, if we eat or if we don't eat, we're no different, but we are. But he's speaking more specifically about the food offered to idols, that if we eat food offered to idols, or if we don't eat food offered to idols, it doesn't make any difference in who we are. We're still the same person, whether we have eaten some grain, some bread, some meat, or whatever it was that was offered to an idol. And they say, it's offered to an idol, or it's sacrificed to an idol, or it's given to an idol. As I said before, the idol can't do anything with it, because the idol does not exist. It doesn't need the nourishment and all of that. But he's warning us. He says, be careful that what you eat and what you do doesn't cause to be a stumbling block for others. And, Jesus and his disciples on a Sabbath day were going through the fields, and they were gleaning some leftover grain, and, so that they had something to eat. They were maybe shelling out a head of wheat. As farmers, most of us have done that at some time. You shell out a head of wheat and you eat it. Barley, not so good. Oats, not so good. Corn, you can eat that raw field corn, but it's kind of dry and chalky. But, we've all done that. And so Jesus got in trouble for working on the Sabbath. This is kind of the same thing that people were picking on Jesus for working on the Sabbath. Well, here people were upset because others were eating food offered to idols. And Paul is saying, if it offends somebody, that's going to get in the way of their Christian faith and their belief in Jesus. I mean, as a person who believes in God, a person who trusts in Jesus, they should know that this idol is a false god. They should know that offering a sacrifice to an idol shouldn't be anything, but yet in their heads, I mean, it was, there were head games going on then as there are today, a lot of head games going on. But, just to think that they were eating this food that had been offered to an idol. I mean, offered to a god. And that's, it's kind of hard to put it into words that way, but I think you understand what I'm saying, is that, they felt that it was something that they shouldn't be having because it was offered to someone or something more important, offering it to God that way, offering it to a God. And he says, if others see you eating it and they possess the knowledge, if they see you eating in the temple of an idol, they might be encouraged to the point of eating food sacrificed to idols as well. But he says, so by your knowledge, don't do something that's going to be a stumbling block to someone else. And there's other places he talks about, being a stumbling block in anyone's faith. He says, you don't want to, by your knowledge of the fact that this food that's offered to an idol is no different than food that you've gone to the marketplace and bought. He says, don't let your knowledge and your trust in that get in the way of someone else who might not believe that, who might still be a little bit in awe of these idols, a little bit leery of eating these idols' food. And then his last thing he says, if food is the causing of their failing, I will never eat meat so that I will not cause any one of them to fail. Well, not all meat was sacrificed to idols. There was, I don't understand that line. And not everybody was a vegan. I mean, there was a lot of consumption of the sheep and of the doves and of the cattle, and this was a common thing. I mean, you can think about it in the Old Testament. That when people came, they would butcher the fatted calf, or when in Jesus' parable of the prodigal son, butcher the prized calf and have a feast for our son. So all meat wasn't off limits to eat, but Paul is using that as an example, that if just eating a bite of meat would cause someone else to doubt their faith in God, he wouldn't do it. I mean, and this is pretty drastic. This is how important faith in God, faith in Jesus is to Paul, that he doesn't want to do anything to cause someone else to wonder or to doubt or to be a stumbling block that way. And I think about, how many people in today's society look at those of us that are in the church and, just call us hypocrites and say, well, just because, this person is that way, there's no way that I want to be in a church that a person like that is in. And, and I think about that as how we live our lives as examples for others. And I know that there's a lot of behavior in churches that doesn't meet up with God's standards of living. But the reality is that we who belong to a church, we who go to a church, we who worship God on a regular basis in the church are sinners just like all the rest of them, just as guilty of sin, just as guilty of doing things we shouldn't do as anybody else. But in this 8th chapter of Corinthians, Paul is saying to these people of Corinth, be careful. Be careful. Set a good example. Do everything you can within reasonable powers of who you are and everything to encourage others in their belief rather than to cause any more concern or any more doubt or any more wondering. And it's hard. It's really tough, when we think about how others may look at us Christians and judge us and judge the whole of Christianity on one person's action or inaction or inability. And just yesterday, my neighbor posted on Facebook that, I think it was yesterday, the song was going through her head, and they'll know we are Christians by our love, They'll know who we are by our love, by the way we are. But they also will know by who we are that we are sinful Christians in need of God's grace and God's glory. So it's that catch-22 of we know what we should do, just like Paul says, the good things that I want to do, I don't do. The bad things that I know I shouldn't do, those I find myself doing. So here in chapter 8, Paul is reminding us that, one of the things that was a stumbling block for a lot of people in his day was this food that had been sacrificed to idols. And, there's... when Paul and Peter and these other disciples were going around in these other towns, and I think especially of in Athens, when they found all of these other idols or places of worship for idols, temples built to idols. I see you are a very devout nation, a very devout city, because you have idols, so many idols, you even have one idol or temple to an unknown God. And he takes that advantage to speak of the God of creation, the God of the Father, Jesus Christ, but so it's just reminding everybody of being aware of who we are in the eyes of others, knowing for certain that we are loved by God, no matter what.